poster, a 4% chance of having age-related macular degeneration. So, curious about this, I went to 23andMe's website to see how they were reporting these data to the average consumer. And you can sign up to get access to data from an example family. And this time, I actually read the little terms of agreements that I usually skip by, so I wanted to see what it said. And in the terms of agreement, it says, it has this to say: educational, research and educational use only. We do not provide medical advice. The genetic information received from 23andMe is based on scientific research and cannot be relied upon at this point for diagnostic purposes. Although it will revolutionize your personalized medicine, but cannot be relied upon. Genetic discoveries that we report have not, for the most part, been clinically validated. So there's this warning here that a lot of people probably skip over, but that's what they're saying to protect themselves. So if you go to the 23andMe age-related macular degeneration report, you'll see a page like this that says what we provide, an estimate of your risk, the results of 3 markers, and some links to some relevant information. And results are displayed like this for the mother in the example family that agreed to share the results. They call this family the Mendel family. So this is the mother in the Mendel family. And we see that at the first marker, so this is the average risk. So the first 2 markers don't alter your risk away from the average risk, whereas the third marker decreases her risk twofold. Now, there's an important point here. These are done using commercially available, pre-designed SNP chips. And so you actually end up using the SNPs that are on the chip that are basically surrogate SNPs and are not the ones that one would choose to use if you were trying to develop the best possible risk prediction. In fact, in late 2009, Craig Bedner's group wrote a paper talking about this, and one of their recommendations about improving the value of these panels would be to directly genotype the risk markers. So for Lily Mendel, the mom in this family, the risk estimate is presented like this, that 3.5 out of 100 people of European ethnicity who share her genotype will get age-related macular degeneration between a certain age range, compared to 7. So this is the twofold change in her risk estimate. Notice what wasn't asked here. It wasn't asked whether or not she smokes. It wasn't asked how old she is. Both of those are major risk factors for this particular trait. So in late 2009, in Nature, there was a paper where they took 5 individuals and sent them to 2 prominent direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies. And then they asked, how often do the risk estimates agree for a variety of traits in direction, not magnitude, just direction. And in green here are where they agreed in direction, and in red here is where they disagreed in direction. And they found that for 70% or less of the predictions of the 2 companies agreed across 5 individuals. So this was the state of the art. You choose one company or the other, depending on what you want your risk to be, I guess. This is the state of the art in late 2009. And why might this be? Well, we sort of have 2 different conflicting goals in how we arrive at the information we have in our hands today. A lot of these risk SNPs were discovered through association analyses, where we use the statistical tools of odds ratios, logistic regression, and p-values, aiming at getting ecological understanding, causation, and things like that. But now we're trying to take those data and sort of change them into this other realm, which deals with classification and prediction, where we should actually be using different statistical techniques. And we have a different aim, finding the markers that maximize clinical validity. So how might one measure clinical validity? Well, I'll show you shortly that the odds ratio and the p-value alone aren't really informative measures of clinical validity, particularly if they're derived from the typical case control study. In this area, we should be more interested in the classification question, which is how well do genetic markers distinguish between cases and controls. And then we end up in a realm of other different acronyms and statistical techniques, some of which I'll define now. I can never remember what they are. So here's the basic definition. So we have a test, and this is the true state of nature up here. There's two sorts of statistics that we're fairly interested in. We're interested in sensitivity, which can be thought of as the true positive fraction. So that's the number of true positives in the category of people who truly have the disease. And its counterpart is the false positive fraction, 1 minus the specificity, which is basically how many false positives you have among those who truly don't have the disease. And when you set up a test for classifying people, you can think of it as having two underlying distributions, and you're drawing a threshold here, and you have a balance. Depending on where you draw this threshold, you're going to have different numbers of people in these different categories. And there's many possible classifiers depending on where you draw this threshold. So another way of summarizing how well a classifier might work is you plot for each, you move the threshold up and down, you plot for each value with the threshold, the false positive fraction versus the true positive fraction. You get this curve, and then you look at the area under the curve, the AUC. So, and the AUC can look like this. If you just flipped a coin, you would get an AUC of 50%. Whereas if you had a really good classifier, you should have something with an AUC around 95%, where your true positive fraction can be quite high, while your false positive fraction is quite low. This AUC can be thought of as probably the classifier will assign a case a higher score and a control a lower score. And as I just mentioned, its practical lower bound is 1, and a perfect classifier has an AUC of 1. This is a good way to describe the discrimination of a classifier if there's no particular trade-off between false positives and false negatives. And in the literature, there's guidelines which say that if you want to screen individuals that you already know are at an increased risk of disease, you want the AUC to be above 75%. At least in the biomarker literature, this is often hard to achieve. And for pre-symptomatic diagnosis in the general population where you're screening everyone, you want the AUC to be quite high, 99%. Now, let's look at so we're used to thinking about genetic risk in terms of odds ratios. Let's look at how that relates to true positive and false positive fractions. So if we think of a binary marker with just 2 levels and with a particular odds ratio, it works out that this mathematical formula holds. And if we graph it out, you see here with an odds ratio of 1.5, you're not very far away from the worthless test that lies on the diagonal. And if you want the true positive fraction to be above 80%, you need quite large, and you want the false positive fraction to be low. You need quite large odds ratios for a binary marker, presence or absence of the risk of it. And this just shows the numbers. So with an odds ratio of 1.5, we have a huge false positive rate because we're over here at 73%, and an AUC just slightly larger than the 50% of a non-informative test. With an odds ratio of 50, we can get the false positive fraction relatively low and the AUC up above 80. But even having an odds ratio above 50 doesn't necessarily guarantee that you have acceptable classification accuracy, because it depends a bit on where you put your threshold. So if you put it up here, so as to have a high true positive fraction, your false positive fraction is much too high. Put it down here to have a really low false positive fraction, your true positive fraction isn't that good. Now that's a 2-level marker. What if we look at SNPs where we had 3 levels for the 3 different phenotypes, and we assume an additive model?